Dead Space, released in 2008, was EA's entrance into the horror genre's Hall of Fame, acclaimed by fans as one of the greats inside of the genre, right up besides Capcom's Resident Evil and Konami's Silent Hill. But as is all too common, it's possible we may have never gotten Resident Evil at all. So join me and let's explore the development studio that had to break conventions to be able to get Dead Space out on the shelves. How a certain game released in the year 2005 changed the entire course of Dead Space's development, and what Dead Space did to create a completely new and original experience inside of a genre that was, at the time, said to have been completely figured out. One of Electronic Arts' oldest studios, Visceral Games, founded in 1998 under its original name, EA Redwood Shores. The first game Redwood Shores developed, called Future Cop LAPD, a third-person shooter released in 1998. Redwood Shores' subsequent games through the early and into the late 2000s were in large part licensed tie-ins with movies and other property, most notably The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King in 2003. However, similar to their first game, Future Cop, the game, although popular among a small subsection of players, the studio by large failed to reach as wide of an audience as they initially projected. What this spelled out was EA's hesitation towards the production of original intellectual property. Now, in retrospective, we can see the mistake that decision was. With Dead Space released in 2008, with completely original characters, gameplay, and plot, this was and still is to this day one of EA's most ambitious projects that, to everyone's surprise, impressed new and old fans alike to the new spin of the horror genre. However, to figure out the origins of the game, we have to travel all the way back to the 1990s, specifically 1994, and the release of a game called System Shock. System Shock was a first-person action-adventure game developed by Looking Glass Technologies, the game which was set in space in a cyberpunk version of the year 2072. You, the player, assuming the role of a nameless security hacker, attempting to hinder the plans of a malevolent artificial intelligence called Shodan. System Shock was hailed for its innovation and influence at the time, and what some would say was really the originator of the FPS and RPG genres, and along with that was also the main influence and predecessor for 2K Games' 2007 release of BioShock, and most recently Bethesda's 2017 release of Prey. However, it also has its roots in the inception of what would eventually become Dead Space. And although it's generally accepted that the game was a success, it did not meet the frenzied popularity of Doom, released only 1 year earlier in December 10th, 1993, and unfortunately fell into obscurity shortly after its release. However, all was not lost. Between the release of System Shock 1 in 1994, System Shock 2 in 1999, and now, these games have developed a large following of fans who are incredibly loyal to System Shock's more complex and intricate gameplay and story. Ironically, System Shock's lack of popularity initially was attributed to the game's steep learning curve. In 2020, it's precisely the game's difficulty and complexity that has made the game amass such a large following nearly 30 years after its release. Among the game's positive reception for its originality, gameplay, and plot, one aspect of the game that has truly stood the test of time, and what System Shock is hailed for most, is the game's atmosphere and immersiveness. Quote by Benjamin Turner said the setting, the style, the sound, the voices, the writing, the tension, the music, and most of all, the atmosphere, combined into one near-perfect whole, System Shock is the progenitor of today's story-based action games. This preference for atmosphere is a far cry from the majority of horror games today, which prioritize action and intensity over the more slow and meticulous gameplay of its predecessors. Horror games, and its subgenre survival horror, were renowned most for the atmosphere and immersiveness these games managed to create. And besides System Shock, the earliest examples of this were found in Resident Evil 1, 2, and Silent Hill, all released within the same 5-year span. In terms of plot and graphical capability, these games were revolutionary for their time. However, it's precisely some of the system's limitations, intentionally or not, which led to the staples of the genre at the time. Fixed camera angles allowed monsters to hide right beyond the bounds of your screen. Restrictive movement controls to disorient the player. The impact this had on gameplay was a feeling of helplessness against the numerous horrors and monstrosities introduced to us in these games. This continued into the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. Something happened in 2005, however, something that would flip the entire horror genre on its head. A single release that would change what survival horror meant. A game that redefined what so many fans of the genre became accustomed to for the better part of 10 years, for better and for worse. Resident Evil 4, the sixth major installment in the Resident Evil series. Resident Evil 4, published by Capcom, which was initially supposed to be a GameCube exclusive, 15 years later has become a cross-platform hit. And without even looking at the reviews, that is a testament to the wild appeal this game managed to garner. Speaking to both the critical and commercial success this game was given. With over 10 million sales spanning 4 generations of consoles, Resident Evil set the precedence for survival horror in the mid-2000s. The game's plot involving the player controlling Leon S. Kennedy, who was sent on a mission to rescue the US president's daughter from an evil cult. Resident Evil 4 departed for this installment from the fixed camera angles that had been so integral to the series up until this point. Resident Evil was survival horror through and through. However, this time around, the game had much more emphasis on action than the slower paced, more atmospheric horror the series' past installments became known for. Resident Evil 4's success did not go unnoticed by Redwood Shore Studios. This was during a time when Electronic Arts was adamant on the studio continuing development of licensed spin-offs, the likes of James Bond, Lord of the Rings, and The Godfather. Ben Wennett went on to say that it was a time at EA when there was no appetite for original IP. It seemed like everybody else was doing it except us. And that's the reason why the development studio was beginning work on System Shock 3. But with the release of Resident Evil 4, this changed everything. The studio was overwhelmed with a desire to create something original, and it was Resident Evil 4 which was the catalyst. And so to ensure that Dead Space could get greenlit, the development team had to break conventions. Uncertain of the exact date the next generation of console was to be released, the team threw all caution to the wind and began developing an early prototype of Dead Space on the original Xbox, ignoring the massive amount of work that it would take to port the game over to the new Xbox 360 that was looming on the horizon. This began a long, arduous process spanning 18 months to create a prototype of the game before ever even introducing the project to the executives at EA. This was a risky attempt to convince the executives at EA to bet on an original idea that had no guarantees to be successful nor profitable. The creator of Dead Space, Glenn Schofield, publicly said that he aimed to create the scariest game of all time. Although it's no doubt that enthusiasm which was responsible in large part for the game's success. Initially, however, the idea could bring apprehension to the executives whose main concern was ultimately profit. If the project was to get greenlit, the developers would have to tread lightly and, more importantly, break some rules. The uncertainty of whether a project that countless of individuals had spent on over the course of 18 months was not in vain. It was precisely this prototype that Glenn Schofield gives credit for Dead Space's appeal among the studio team and the team's higher-ups. The developers behind Dead Space did not have an easy road ahead of them. They had to balance a fine line, create a game that was unique enough to avoid being labeled as a Resident Evil clone, all the while having to work within the bounds of what made Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and the like so successful. Eventually, Glenn Schofield broke the ice, showing some promising progress, and over time slowly built confidence EA needed to give the project a thumbs up. And a few prototype levels and the new inspiration from Resident Evil 4 wasn't going to be enough to create the masterpiece that would inevitably become Dead Space. 2008 Dead Space was EA's debut entry into the Dead Space series, following a chapter-based narrative, while having the player solving environmental puzzles and finding ammunition and equipment to survive against the massing horde of undead flesh. As the name suggests, Dead Space was a sci-fi horror game set in the outer reaches of deep space. The player controls a system engineer named Isaac Clarke, who is part of the rescue team called to the USG Ishimura, a planet-cracking vessel mining on the planet Aegeus, which has gone radio silent. Upon entering the ship and discovering the monstrosities on board, the necromorphs, It's up to the player to piece together exactly what happened and discover the origins of the marker.
Come on. Got it.
A mysterious artifact that was dug up on Aegeus and what is responsible for the ensuing massacre of the ship's residents. And it's in the way the story is told that is the first way Dead Space managed to stand out from Resident Evil 4, with an emphasis on a far more passive form of storytelling, with many of the mysteries of the crew on board and leading weeks prior to the discovery of the marker discovered through audio and video logs. This was a very important element of Dead Space's atmospheric horror, and it's what the developers prioritized since the starting concepts of the game. You'll find littered throughout the ship signs, graffiti, and bodies, intentionally placed for the player to piece together what exactly happened leading up to the ensuing massacre. Isaac Clarke, Dead Space's main protagonist, is a far cry from Resident Evil's Leon S. Kennedy. An intentional decision was made for Isaac Clarke to have zero dialogue. This went in contrast to Resident Evil 4's protagonist's bravado and flamboyant attitude, which admittedly worked in that game. However, if the developers were aiming to create a truly terrifying experience, that would not cut it. Which is why Dead Space's creator Glenn Schofield wanted to ensure that Isaac Clarke was silent. A high stakes, high reward decision that would ultimately pay off. This was a crucial decision if the game was to be successful in truly portraying the horrors among the Ishimura. The mute protagonist Isaac Clarke brought a silent unease and tension to the unfolding mysteries of the ship. The player could more easily empathize with our protagonist and was in no small part what was largely responsible for the immersiveness of the game. The developers knew how integral sound design was going to be in accomplishing the goal of creating the scariest game of all time. If the developers truly wanted to bring the USG Ishimura's horror to life, it was going to be the game's sound design and score that was going to accomplish that. Jason Grave, responsible for the game's score, went on to win several awards for Dead Space's soundtrack, both as a standalone soundtrack and as part of the game's sound design. The main goal of the soundtrack was to bring an unfamiliarity, confusion, and tension that accompanied the gameplay. And for this to work, two different elements that comprised the game's soundtrack would have to meld perfectly. To accomplish this, Jason Grave's soundtrack would opt out of what would be traditionally considered music, with the rejection of recognizable features like melodies. The score instead bombarded the listener with a barrage of sounds, sporadic and chaotic. It was a full-on aural assault, melding shrieking strings, pounding percussion, and deeply layered brasses. Every decision made by the developers aimed to create as terrifying and immersive experience as possible. Dead Space was a mix between System Shock's slower paced, more atmospheric horror, with even more heart-pounding intensity than Resident Evil 4. And although the influences of these titles are obvious to see, Dead Space managed to stand out entirely on its own by never diverging off of one major tenet: innovation. And we can see this with the heavy emphasis on realism through the removal of heads-up display elements, opting for all information during gameplay to be displayed on the character instead of on the screen. Health bar and status integrated into Isaac's armor suit, and ammo displayed on the weapons. The absence of HUD elements during gameplay also influenced developers' decision to opt out of cutscenes. Every piece of the game's dialogue, events, voice, and video logs all happen in real time, creating a seamless experience that truly draws the player in to the endless horrors of the USG Ishimura. And unlike Resident Evil 4, the developers knew that they wanted the player to be able to move while also being able to shoot simultaneously. A foreign idea to veterans of the series at the time, with every single Resident Evil installment requiring for the player to stop moving before shooting. The developers wanted to instill every single enemy encounter with a palpable sense of tension. And the unintended consequence of both these factors are what led the developers to create the single most unique and integral gameplay mechanic in Dead Space: strategic dismemberment. And this key design feature began to have large influences over every single other aspect of the game. The enemies and weapons were developed to work with this mechanic hand in hand. This surprised developers by adding an element of strategy previously undiscovered. The exact area you aimed your gun now became of utmost importance. The fine motor skills required to orient your gun over the dozens of possible points of contact added a complexity, with headshots putting ensuing necromorphs into a frenzy, or into the stomach, causing a swarm of parasites to attack the player. The precision aim required on the player's part, all the while several necromorphs swarm in from different directions, was a fundamental aspect in avoiding the various enemy encounters from becoming stale.
Collision detected in the main hangar bay. Emergency crews have been notified.
Combined with the fact that enemy spawn points and placement was now improved through a new spawn system that was developed to avoid the redundant placement of enemies inside of rooms. How this new mechanic worked was dependent entirely on where the player was positioned inside of a room at any given time. With this, now necromorphs could spawn at any of the various vents and shafts that littered each and every room, creating situations oftentimes where the player would be fleeing from oncoming terrors of necromorphs only to find necromorphs converging from behind them. The distinctive ways the developers combated the heavy reliance of enemy encounters in the survival horror genre, and how they managed to avoid it from becoming boring, was precisely how Dead Space managed to keep the same amount of tension and dread from the first encounter all the way through to the last. This makes Dead Space have the same amount of action as Resident Evil 4 without sacrificing any of the game's tension. Dead Space would go on to be nominated for dozens of awards. Out of the numerous nominations, winning Action Game of the Year, with the majority of the awards praising the heart-pounding intensity of its soundtrack. The game was a success. Dead Space received positive reception from critics and fans alike. Game Informer, GameSpot, IGN, and Metacritic all reveling in the game's accomplishment of creating a truly terrifying atmosphere. However, even with the incredible reception from fans, it wouldn't go on to sell as well as some of the other games released just that same year. After Dead Space's release, fans of the series were waiting in anticipation of news regarding the possible announcement of a continuation of Isaac Clarke's story in the form of a sequel, Dead Space 2. And after only 3 short years, Dead Space 2 was released. However, this game faced a far more crueler fate.